Good morning. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm the Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Global Security. We're pleased to be here today at the Canadian Parliament to launch a report published by the London-based China Strategic Risks Institute to talk about threats to the Canadian Arctic, particularly coming from China. We've seen in the past year increased geopolitical competition, unraveling of the world order, and an increased focus on Canada's Arctic. And so we feel that there's a need to inform the Canadian public, to inform policymakers on the challenges we face from authoritarian states that are eyeing our resources, eyeing our territory, threatening our sovereignty. So we're here today to talk about this in detail. We really want to ensure that the Canadians around the country, from west to east, north to south, understand that there are actors that we should not be dependent on, and we should actually take measures to protect our sovereignty and protect the Arctic and work with our allies on this. So with that being said, I would like to turn from our colleagues, Elizabeth Donkervoort, to talk about the report before turning to our other two experts today.
Thank you, Kyle, and good morning. My name is Elizabeth Donkervoort, and I'm a director with the China Strategic Risks Institute. Now, the Arctic is entering a new phase of strategic competition, and China has become the most active non-Arctic player in the region. Our report examines the challenge across several dimensions, including defense, security dynamics, the implications of Russia's war in Ukraine, and growing competition over rare earths and other critical minerals. Now, the report was finalized late last year, and we have already seen some positive steps towards implementing some of its recommendations by the Canadian government, but there are significant governance gaps that still remain. China's growing presence raises two core concerns for Canada related to sovereignty and security. On sovereignty, China promotes the idea that the Arctic should be treated as a global commons, where non-Arctic states have equal rights of access and extraction that directly challenges Canadian long-standing position that waters such as the Northwest Passage fall under Canadian jurisdiction. It also risks undermining the autonomy and governance of local communities that live in the Canadian Arctic, as well as environmental protections. On security, we see expanding presence and dual-use infrastructure can create long-term dependencies and surveillance risks for northern communities as well as Canada as a whole. Our report details how Chinese activities fall across the spectrum, from economic investment in mining to scientific collaboration and polar research vessels to offers to finance critical infrastructure in remote communities. Now, the challenge does not lie in any single activity or individual investment, but the cumulative effect of an incremental strategy that builds access, relationships, and influence in the Arctic over time. This also reflects a broader pattern of foreign interference Canada has been confronting as a country. Now, influence is rarely direct. It is built gradually through partnerships, investment, and engagement that appear cooperative but can shift decision-making over time. In the Arctic, Indigenous and Inuit communities are central to the challenge, yet they are often not provided with the resources, information, or technical support needed to fully assess these complex Chinese investment proposals. Many Arctic communities face significant infrastructure gaps. This is true in areas such as broadband and transportation. And so these infrastructure investment offers from China can appear attractive because they're addressing real community needs. But these proposals also carry significant and potential national security implications. Now, I want to be clear. It's not that these northern communities aren't aware of the potential risks, but they are not given the information or have the China-specific expertise that is necessary to evaluate the full impact of these seemingly local projects. This also reflects a similar trend and pattern and playbook that we've seen in Belt and Road initiatives, where China is offering critical infrastructure in under-resourced areas in exchange for economic access or long-term leverage. We've seen these dynamics play out in Sri Lanka, where Chinese financing for the Hambantota Todi port ultimately resulted in a 99-year lease to China, or in Djibouti, where infrastructure investment ultimately was followed by the establishment of China's first overseas military base near the port facilities. Now, I'm not saying that the exact same thing is going to happen in Canada, but our report highlights how Chinese-affiliated officials have approached the hamlet of Grise Fiord in Nunavut with an offer to build a deep-water port, potentially creating an entry point for infrastructure proposals with broader strategic implications. They also have polar vessels, Xuelong and Xuelong 2, which regularly conduct Arctic missions, allowing them to collect critical information on the seabed and underwater mapping. They also increased China's operational presence, normalizing its position in the Canadian Arctic. Now, by approaching these communities directly, these investments also bypass federal review processes and falling outside the Investment Canada Act. If they're unsolicited, these offers are further outside the scope of the Investment Canada Act. And so we need to make sure that Inuit and Indigenous communities are genuine partners in addressing these issues and bringing them forward and being able to give them the resources to properly evaluate these proposals and think about what's best not only for their community but for Canada as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I would now like to invite Member of Parliament Shuvaloy Majumdar to take the floor.
Thanks, Kyle. Well, thank you, everybody, and good morning. My compliments to Kyle Matthews, the Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Global Security, my friends and former colleagues, Alex Dalziel, Senior Fellow in Arctic Security at MIGS, Elizabeth Donkervoort, Director for the China Strategic Risks Institute, who does incredible work on dealing with our common threats posed by China. China, as we all know, has been the disruptor, the rupture from over a decade ago to the international system. The shocks that Beijing has imposed around the world has been something that Canadians have had to struggle with in their day-to-day life, in our trade security, our sovereignty, and our ability to carry on in our strategic alliances. What we have learned in recent studies is that Beijing is a primary threat to Canada's Arctic. The Canadian Security Intelligence Service confirmed this assessment at the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development on February 14, underscoring the growing strategic challenge posed by China's expanding presence in the north. And so I'm very grateful for this report that I think every parliamentarian, policymaker, minister, and Canadian should read. It is a report that discovers some significant gaps, as Elizabeth has described just now. Surveillance and domain awareness gaps. Canada's northern surveillance infrastructure is outdated, and slow modernization under the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, leaves Canada underprepared to detect unconventional threats. Second, investment and infrastructure screening gaps. The Investment Canada Act does not adequately capture unsolicited or subnational foreign infrastructure offers, particularly those directed at Indigenous or territorial governments. Third, scientific and technological presence. China uses science diplomacy to advance data gathering and infrastructure projects with potential dual-use applications. Fragmented federal coordination has left openings for exploitation, and they must be closed immediately. Fourth, maritime awareness gaps. Canada's incomplete maritime domain awareness means increased vessel traffic, particularly by state-affiliated operators, may go undetected, especially if supported by foreign-financed dual-use infrastructure. Let's not be naive about this. China is not an Arctic nation, yet claims to try and be one. China's commercial efforts in Greenland and elsewhere is a project of weaponized commerce. It has proven as such over the last decade in regions around the world, as has already been described. And fifth, finally, policy gap. While Canada's Arctic and Northern Policy Framework and NORAD modernization commitments are steps forward, they are not keeping pace with the immediacy of China's expanding Arctic sovereignty. Beijing is not waiting for Canada to catch up. Its polar research vessels, deep-sea monitoring systems, and state-directed Arctic strategy are already operational. While Liberals debate frameworks and timelines, the CCP in Beijing is moving quietly, deliberately, and with strategic intent. Canada must recognize the threat with clear eyes and act accordingly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, MP Majumdar. I would now like to invite my institute's Senior Fellow in Arctic Security, Alex Dalziel, to the floor.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Shuv. Thank you, Elizabeth, for discussing this important topic this morning. So as mentioned, I'm Alex Dalziel. I'm the Senior Fellow for Arctic Security at the Montreal Institute for Global Security. Today's report provides a valuable window. It provides a valuable window into China as a growing strategic challenge for Canada's Arctic, and that is the fundamental takeaway we need to keep in mind here. It argues that Arctic security is Canada's national security and that a mix of calibrated regional and global strategies and actions are required if we are to meet this challenge. As Elizabeth mentioned, this is about a full spectrum challenge. It's about economic security to protect our infrastructure, and it's about research security to protect our science. China is pushing on all of these fronts. And these fronts also point to the likelihood of China's growing future military capabilities in the Arctic. An important point in the paper to realize is that China's extensive collaboration with Russia is advancing China's Arctic interests, enabling its presence, advancing its capabilities through transfer of technology, skills, and presence. China is pushing hard on the commercial front, taking advantage of Arctic sea lanes, passing the Russian coast to reach Europe, and is looking at technologies, as the report points out, to improve the quality of its nuclear submarine fleet. It's important to keep in mind that even on the scientific front, this is dual-use technology, dual-use knowledge that can be applied in a whole range of domains, including in the military one. It's very important in Canada that we have an ongoing conversation about building and protecting dual-use and multiple-use infrastructure, a key point in this paper. We need a concerted effort to devise governance mechanisms to support secure infrastructure development at all levels of Canadian government, ground up and top down. The paper adds another rationale for an urgent commitment from the government to strengthen its surveillance capabilities in the Arctic, bridge persistent infrastructure gaps between North and South in Canada, collaborate with Indigenous Canadians and other levels of government, and tighten our cooperation with Arctic democracies. China is using all of its tools on the Arctic front. That calls for a whole-of-government approach by the Canadian federal government for the same problem. Thank you.
And I would just like to remind everyone listening, the report can be found on the website of the China Strategic Risks Institute. It is a very detailed report that you can look at and see both from the global security and national security, how this impacts Canada, and as well as a full set of proposals that the Government of Canada and other like-minded countries can do to work together to protect Canada's sovereignty and security. With that being said, if there's any journalist in person or online that would like to ask a question, we are free and available to do so.
Yeah. Emma Godner with CBC. I'll ask, Elizabeth, you mentioned some examples of some concrete threats. I'm thinking that Canadians probably remember a lot from late 2022, early 2023 with the concerns around surveillance balloons, buoys that were found in Canadian waters. Are there other examples like that that we're starting to see continue? I'd also like to invite my colleagues to address that as well. You know, looking more at the more difficult challenge, I think, is if we're looking at how information is being collected and deployed and how these narratives are being used to shape the way people are perceiving not only the Canadian government, but their own local communities. And that becomes a real challenge. And it's very difficult to actually identify and point to things without necessarily increasing xenophobia or rising racism, and without also overlooking opportunities where there can be genuine engagement. And so I don't want to point to very specific examples of this right now, but to have us all take a step back and think about how are we engaging with the government? How are we also engaging with the information that we're getting there, and what information are we putting out there? The appointment of an ambassador for the Arctic is going to be really critical in helping combat these narratives, and also helping raise to the fore these issues that are more critical of China, which China is definitely trying to hide and not have that come out there. And that's the bigger challenge, I think, is we're not going to be able to assess the maligness or the negative aspects of a lot of these infrastructure projects if we don't have the full and complete picture. And Beijing is working very hard at making sure we don't have that complete picture, both globally and here in Canada. Alex, I don't know if you had anything to add.
I'll just quickly add, I mean, China's activities last summer, mostly in the North Pacific, Beaufort Sea, Chukchi Sea, off the Bering Strait, and Alaska, is directly relevant to Canada and Canada's security. These are so far in line with international law and sailing in international waters, but pushing right up to the edges. And they're certainly signaling, just as is China's use of Russia's northern sea route to move to ship via sea routes to Europe. I think one of the crucial questions here is around governance, and is Russia enforcing the standards that the Arctic community had very carefully devised for safe shipping, environmentally sound shipping, and will China abide by those?
Sure. I'll ask a follow-up as well. Just on the point about the Arctic ambassador being an opportunity, are there more opportunities that you think the government should take advantage of now that there is somebody who's in the Arctic ambassador position? What would you like to see that position accomplish in this context?
I would definitely like to see that ambassador taking a proactive stance in talking about Arctic states versus non-Arctic states. We can't allow Beijing to shift the narrative to be talking about near-Arctic states, which is a self-proclaimed term that they made. We also need to be very cognizant of the fact that while the Arctic has significant importance to the globe, it does fall within Canada's territorial jurisdiction as well as the other Arctic 8 countries, and that there are communities in Canada living in the Canadian Arctic, and their voices must be heard. And I believe the ambassador really does need to work to be integrating Indigenous and Inuit voices into the priorities, not only helping them evaluate these projects, but understanding what is important and what needs to be done.
Dylan Robertson, the Canadian Press, please go ahead.
Hi there. Thanks for taking our questions. Sorry for the audio here. I'm wondering if you could speak to how this government and its predecessor have talked about China in the Arctic in terms of the Arctic foreign policy that came out under Trudeau, Carney before the Beijing visit, and especially after the Beijing visit. It seems like every time the foreign minister has spoken about threats to the Arctic, Russia is always named. I'm not sure if China is coming up. Have you seen a shift there, and how should we be publicly messaging about these countries?
Thank you for the question. I think we have seen a shift in terms of Canadian strategic discussion of this, where Russia is seen as the current threat, the established threat, and China as the emerging threat. I think it's very important that Canada keep in mind that the Arctic almost as a whole is a strategic sector. So any engagement with non-Arctic countries in general, but particularly with governments such as those of China, needs to be subject to extremely high levels of scrutiny and caution. It's the Nordic countries and the United States with which we will build security in the Arctic. These are the relationships most important. We should certainly be active with many countries in encouraging science, et cetera, in cooperation with Canada. But the nature of the governments in Beijing and Moscow, present a particularly sharp challenge to, in the short, medium-term relations that involve Arctic matters.
Yeah, Dylan, thank you for the question. I think it's a very a thoughtful one. What we have seen is that Prime Minister Carney traveling to Beijing, describing Canada's alignment with Beijing's New World Order. It wasn't just a series of trade agreements that the Prime Minister had made on behalf of Canada. It included security arrangements and security dialogues. This is, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of the threat to the Canadian strategic interest, especially our own sovereign Arctic region. For too long, this government and the one that preceded it have had an obsession with trying to appease and accommodate Beijing's expansionist attitudes towards Canada and our country. And so I think it's important for Canadians to understand that this is a decision point that the government has to make about securing our country by not just establishing diplomats, whether it be an ambassador for the Arctic or a diplomatic presence in Greenland, but the hard material and the economic interests that we need to defend with great zeal. For a year, they've been not acting with the pace that they should be, with the urgency that they should be. For a year, they have been cloaking much of their concerns in the Arctic around language with Russia. But Russia would never be able to accomplish its strategic goals in the Arctic were it not for China's backing, and the government needs to recognize it. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Dylan, for that question. It's a very long and complicated answer, and I've been told to keep my answers short and to the point. But really, when we're talking about the Arctic, when we're talking about the integrated approach that Beijing is applying through its foreign affairs agenda, the Arctic is one major part of it as it relates to Canada, but this is genuinely, from the Chinese perspective, a whole-of-government initiative. Every part is integrated. We've talked about dual-use and multi-use infrastructure. We're talking about outreach through exchange, people-to-people exchanges being exploited or leveraged in ways that promote Beijing's narrative. Addressing this similarly requires a whole-of-government approach, and that takes not only time, but resources. And recognizing the reality that we're in right now in the very dynamic global economic environment, there's a lot of balancing that needs to be made. And what I would really like to see is making sure that we're not prioritizing economic investment over everything, that we're stopping and we're not making things move quickly. We are moving steadfastly and towards a common objective in improving Canadian economy and making it more independent, but we're doing so with a clear-eyed approach that actually does consider Canadian values and does consider things like human rights and does consider the way that we want to shape our communities, not just in the northern Canada, but across Canada, and thinking through that and prioritizing that in our discussions and evaluations of all of these different economic opportunities.
And if I can just get a follow-up, I'm wondering as well what sort of posture we should have towards the current Trump administration when it comes to this issue, specifically looking at the integration of Russian concerns, of Russian oligarchs with the Trump administration, but also the Northwest Passage. As you mentioned, China wants this seen as international waters. I believe that that's also been the American policy. I'm wondering how much we can advance our concerns about adversarial states in the Arctic and how much of this we might have to wait until a later presidency.
I don't think we can wait till the next presidency. I think that this needs to be a continual effort by Canada to express, Canada's well-founded positions on the nature of the waters in the Arctic, as well as, the benefits of close Canada-U.S. cooperation and, some of the basic fundamentals of that cooperation, and respect for Indigenous rights and self-determination, et cetera. So I think Canada needs to push this line. We need to make the hard investments in, things that reinforce NORAD. We need to look creatively with our Greenlandic neighbors, our Danish neighbors, the Nordic countries, on how we collectively convince the United States that NATO and North American transatlantic cooperation are crucial. I also think there's a role here for Japan, South Korea, as we saw last week with Prime Minister Carney in Tokyo. Discussions of the Arctic are coming up in a lot of different places: Canberra, Tokyo, New Delhi, etc. So Canada really needs to be on the front foot with this, and certainly the U.S. Is an absolutely essential part for Canada to have the most robust defense and security it can have. But certainly, I think we need to stand on our own 2 feet and tell the Americans exactly the sort of Arctic that we want to see take shape, ideally with them as partners.
All right, thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci, c'est ce qui conclut cette conférence de presse.